Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Game of Thrones, the role-playing game for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is a role-playing game developed by Cyanide Studios and published by Focus Home Interactive or Atlas, depending on your region, in May of last year. And it was met with a fairly mixed reception. People did find some things to like about it, other people didn't find things to like about it. And so, the question becomes, was this a faithful game to the novels or the show? Or what happened there, and why did it get a mixed reception in the first place? Was there any validity to it? Well, before we really delve into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, which is pretty weak, actually. The graphics in this game are not impressive by any stretch of the imagination. They're acceptable, but the low-res texture work in a lot of places, the very sluggish and awkward animations just across the board, including lots of clipping, the rather weird-looking modeling in a lot of spots, it all just blends together to make a rather unpleasant-looking game. And not unpleasant in the sense of, oh, it's meant to be unpleasant. No, it's unpleasant in the sense of it's just not good quality graphics. Now, again, it's acceptable, but it's just one of those things that makes you go, ugh, that doesn't look good. And then there's the sound design, which is even weaker than the graphics, actually. While you do have two people from the actual show returning to their roles, and those are, of course, the voices for Mormont and Varys, the rest of the cast is awful. There's a lot of really awkward delivery, there's a lot of really just bizarre ways of saying things. It just sounds awful. It's kind of amateurish voice acting that you'd kind of expect out of a game from the 90s rather than a more modern game where we have plenty of good quality voice actors available. Maybe they just didn't have access to the quality voice actors, I don't know, but it really is a problem. And then the sound effects themselves are really, really wimpy. When you're fighting, it does not sound like you're really fighting. It just kind of goes ding, ding, ding. Really pathetic noises that just don't give you a lot of oomph that you would expect out of combat. So, ultimately the presentation falls really flat on its face. Obviously what really matter are the story and the gameplay. In a game based on A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones, the story and characters in particular are extremely important. Now, you play as two characters over the course of the game. The first of them is Mors Westford. He is a member of the Night's Watch and is also a skin changer, which is an incredibly rare thing in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's basically someone who can shift their consciousness into animals and thus actually control the animal and that sort of thing. And this does have a gameplay application as well. With regards to the second character, it's Alistair Sarwick, who is a former lord who went off and became a Red Priest. What a Red Priest is a follower of the religion that worships the god R'hllor, which is really weird for people in Westeros, because they either follow the Seven or the Old Gods. And so this actually creates quite a bit of animosity between Alistair and the people that in his hometown and everything, because he is, after all, now an outsider as opposed to someone who they know and trust. And when he comes back to basically retrieve his family's assets, because he is the oldest son of his father, when his father dies, of course, he runs into a lot of problems, and that's really where the story actually kicks off. With Mors' story, it actually starts out with Mors first, and he's at the wall, he's basically chasing down deserters and fighting wildlings and things like that. And then he gets notification from Jon Arryn, who is the Hand of the King, obviously the King's right hand, and has to go off on a task for that because Jon Arryn is pretty much an old friend of his. And their stories eventually do meet up. You have Alistair basically trying to retrieve his family's assets to return as Lord of Riverspring, to prevent his sister from getting married to this real dick named Valar. He's just a horrible person. And the entire game, Alistair's having to just try to impede his plans and everything. Whereas Moores is trying to find this woman and get her to safety. You eventually find out that the woman is actually pregnant with the offspring of the king. He really gets around. That's a big trait of him. He really gets around. But that's why everybody's basically after her. So the stories converge with that particular aspect, and over time you do get to see these characters' histories develop and everything. You get to see where they came from, what their situations were that led to them being a Red Priest as well as a member of the Night's Watch, because most people don't go to the Wall by choice. And when they actually meet up, the story really does kick off. The problem is that while the story itself is not bad by any means, and while it does fit in with A Song of Ice and Fire, it's just questionable. There's a lot of things in it that just seem overblown. Like they were trying to preserve the canon of A Song of Ice and Fire, but at the same time were trying to inject their own storyline into the events that happen in Game of Thrones, the novel. So it ends up being kind of a weird situation where it's just kind of hard to resolve the whole situation without it actually seeming to have an effect on the books and everything. It's just a really, really weird story in the long run because of this. If you just treat it as its own standalone thing, it's actually not bad, but if you have to tie it in with the books and everything to really understand it all, and that's where the problems present themselves. It also really doesn't help that it's really hard to get attached to any of the characters in this game. Partly because of the bad voice acting, but partly because they're pretty much just all manipulative. And admittedly, that's a very big trait for A Song of Ice and Fire, but there's just so much left up to you with regards to Moores and Alistair as far as what they say and how they react to things and such like that, that you can't really get attached to them per se, and you can't really get attached to the side characters either, because most of them that recur are the kind of people that you just really, really hate. Just because they're horrible people. They do horrible things, and they revel in it, basically. So the characters aren't really that strong. The story is decent, but the characters aren't really that strong, and that really does present a problem, because you just sit there going, oh boy, here we go again. Seeing this coming from a mile away. So-and-so, you're too idealistic. So-and-so, you're a dick, therefore you're probably going to succeed. Blah, blah, blah. So, what about the gameplay? Well, the gameplay is generally spent doing one of three things. The first is running around trying to find whatever you need to actually find, like people or objects or something like that. To do this, you will, of course, just be running around yourself. If you play as Alistair, he eventually gets this ability that allows him to just stop for a second, but he will be able to reveal hidden items, which allows you to find stuff like hidden coins as well as hidden documents and all sorts of different things that you might need to actually complete a quest or something like that. There's also, with Moores, the ability to actually use the dog to sniff out, obviously, trails that will lead you to various things, as well as hidden items, characters, you name it. You can also use the dog for stealth takedowns, which is kind of cool, but mostly you're going to be using that dog to find hidden items. And with both characters, there is, of course, that ability to find hidden items. You just have to do it in different ways. Now, that's only a decent-sized chunk of the game, running around and such like that. I did notice issues with the camera when I'm doing that sort of thing, where the camera will kind of spaz out on you occasionally. It got really annoying. And you can't really move all that quickly. You're jogging, but you're not really moving very quickly, so it does get monotonous after a while. They try to break this up with dialogue and combat. Now, the dialogue is done via a dialogue wheel, and it's not like Mass Effect's dialogue wheel where you're always going to be picking one particular dialogue tree over another. Now, in this one, the options actually change just over time. One response may not be the same kind of response that you would have used before. Say, for instance, you chose a Paragon-ish response in, say, Mass Effect. When you go to find a new dialogue option, the Paragon stuff is always in the same spot. In this one, not the case. It will alter depending on the dialogue choices. And so it's a more dynamic system. Keeps you more on your toes. You have to really pay attention to the dialogue itself and really think what kind of responses you want to give, because it does actually pay to be pretty diplomatic in this game. In certain situations, you can talk your way out of, or you can mess up the dialogue and have to fight your way out of it, or something like that. So your choices in the dialogue do actually affect things in the world around you. And your choices in the game do also affect the outcome of the plot eventually. So that's certainly a nice touch. And that dialogue system does really feel like an RPG element that's really close to what the actual idea of an RPG is. But the dialogue itself usually isn't all that great. Talking to people gets very monotonous over time because the characters just aren't all that interesting. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So, what about the combat, speaking of swords? Well, the combat should be the most interesting part of the game, right? It's actually the most complex. You do have a variety of stats and skills and talents and such like that you can use in the combat realm. Obviously, you have skills that will increase your armor's effectiveness, your weapons' effectiveness, such like that. Your talents will give you new abilities to use in combat, like you'll be able to interrupt enemies' attacks. If they're using special attacks, it'll let you know, and then you can use an interrupt to just stop them in their tracks. Really handy. And so you get all these abilities, and you go into the combat situation, and it seems like it's trying to be kind of a tactical situation. You have 3 different armor types: light, medium, and heavy. Each of them having their own respective weaknesses and better weapons that they're good against. What I mean by that is, heavy armor is better against stuff like slashing weapons, but weak against stuff like bludgeoning, and medium armor is weak against perforating weapons, but better against stuff like bludgeoning, and so on and so forth. So there is some tactical aspect to the combat itself. You do have to pay attention to what you're doing, what the enemy is doing, what your abilities are. If you're surrounded, you're going to be wanting to use more of the area abilities. You do have a stamina meter, and that will deplete very, very quickly, and it regenerates very, very slowly. So that's something to keep in mind. On top of that, your health goes down pretty quickly as well, particularly if you're playing as Alistair, because he's not all that sturdy. Particularly if you're playing as a water dancer. There are various classes available for both characters. And while Moore's has the distinct strength of being able to use two-handed weapons very effectively if you choose the right class, and he can use sword and shield very effectively and stuff like that, he's the more actual fighter build, whereas Alistair is the more light, graceful kind of character. He's more like a rogue in practice, but both of these characters are trying to be prime for fighting, and in Alistair's case, he really isn't. He's decent against guys in medium armor, usually, because pretty much all of his classes are good with perforating weapons rather than slashing or bludgeoning weapons like Moore's. And so you might run into problems with that. But the combat itself ends up devolving into extremely sluggish, slow-paced waiting. You sit there and you wait for the guys to go through their really sluggish animations. You sit there and wait for your energy to refill. Even if you're using stuff like potions, you actually do get potions. You have to get flasks to get potions. And then refill your flasks every time you want more potions. You can only have a limited number of uses of those potions. Each of them basically being, hey, you can increase your health again, or, well, replenish your health, I should say. Or you can replenish your energy, or you can increase the rate at which your energy replenishes, and such like that. Or you can actually get them with poisons, and that will help you out in combat. And Moores also has the distinct ability to command his dog to actually fight things. But all of this stuff involves a lot of waiting. With regards to the potions, some of them don't have an immediate effect. In fact, they seem not to. Or if they do have an immediate effect, it's nullified because your guy's taking so much damage or something like that. And so what ends up happening with the combat is a lot of waiting to see if they're going to be doing special attacks, in which case then you hit the interrupt, because you don't want to just use them and then deplete all of your stamina and then they get in a really good lucky hit and suddenly you're down. Because the game isn't easy. Right off the bat, it is not easy. So the combat ends up taking the majority of your time in this game, and it's actually the weakest aspect in the game, despite being the most complex. So it's kind of a weird situation. And part of it is that everything in this game is so incredibly expensive, yet you get almost nothing in the way of money. So you're lucky to basically get gold coins at all. You'll get a lot of silver, but you won't get gold very much. And so what you'll find is that all the good stuff costs several gold pieces, and you don't have that. At least not until much, much later in the game. So the combat system itself is pretty much unfair as a result. Yes, you level up over time. It takes a long time to level up, too. And you do get better, and you do get more abilities, and you can use flasks to buff up your abilities and such like that if you have to. But the combat just becomes such a big chore. And you'll be fighting, and all of a sudden you'll die, and you'll be like, well, gotta reload that save. At least you can save anywhere, right? So the game itself, while the story is pretty solid, again, the characters aren't all that great. Most of them are kind of cutouts, almost. The dialogue isn't all that impressive, even though the system itself is certainly appreciated and very RPG-like. The combat is, in theory, solid, but in practice ends up being this just really sluggish, monotonous, tedious, just drag. And the game really doesn't justly reward you. You don't really feel like you're going anywhere with regards to your equipment and such. You really do have to rely on the game to give you things, as opposed to being able to do all these side quests, build up your funds, and then actually buy stuff that's useful to you. Instead, you're kind of just stuck. So all of that blends together to create a game that ends up being rather mediocre. It really doesn't help that you have the camera issues, or that there's quite a few bugs and glitches in the game. With one really big one for me was that just all of a sudden the game would just refuse to actually start up. It would just crash on startup. Had to reinstall it, and it worked fine after that, but it was really annoying. There's a few performance hiccups here and there, which is really weird considering my system is more than capable of handling this thing, and it really doesn't look all that great. And so, ultimately, the best thing about the game is just the use of the theme from the show. The rest of it is a mess of good ideas, bad ideas, and just really, really mediocre execution. And it's a shame. Because if there's something that would work really, really, really well if you had a really good team working on it, it's a Game of Thrones / Song of Ice and Fire RPG. So, if they do ever make another one down the line, I really hope they learned lessons from this one. Because this one, just a mediocre experience overall. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.